In the next section, we'll talk about security governance. Now, what does it mean, governance? When you think of the term governance when it comes to information assurance, what is the first thing you think of?
To control or administer.
Right. Some sort of law, regulation, control, something that's going to drive your posture, right? And that's what this is all about, right? Laws and governance include things like NIST, ITIL, ISO, COSO, COBIT. We'll talk about these as we go through this lesson here. You will have to know these governance components for the exam, so you're going to have to be familiar with all these different bodies, and that's really one of the challenging things or challenging aspects of the exam is kind of keeping these different governance organizations and governance bodies identified and separate from each other. But governance can drive your investment decisions based on your business mission, your business posture, whatever it may be. Information technology dependence must align with potential risk to the business. Like I said, we might be in the same business sector that another organization might be in. Let me think of a good example. You know, a little mom and pop credit union is in the financial sector, financial industry. But are they more likely to be a target than, say, Bank of America or Wells Fargo or Chase? Well, it depends, right? Depends what that target is. But generally speaking, the Bank of Americas, the Chases, the Wells Fargos, they're going to have a bigger target on their back because they're, quite frankly, much larger. It's kind of like the whole United Airlines thing, right, where the guy got dragged off the plane. Instead of suing the security organization that was really responsible for dragging the guy off the plane, they sue United because United is a bigger opportunity, right? They're going to have deeper pockets. They're the ones that are in the front of the story. They're the ones that are more visible than the actual airport security folks. So it's interesting that that's the way it works. So governance provides mechanisms for stakeholders. By the way, what's a stakeholder? Anybody that's involved in a process, a technology or whatever. A board of directors and management for proper oversight to managing your risk. Okay? And the thing about governance that's different than policy and procedure, policy and procedure is generally considered to be optional, right? If an organization decides that they want to do something because it's in the best interest of their organization, that's different than governance. Governance means that you're regulated to those standards, right? HIPAA for the healthcare industry, Sarbanes-Oxley, GLBPA or whatever, I forget the acronym, but a bunch of different regulations and rules that fit into these industries, right? Governance ensures security activities are adopted to reduce your risk, that you have the appropriate technology in place, you're investing in the right technology, and that the executive management is engaged. You'll see that a lot throughout this course, right? Executive management needs to be engaged. Board of directors need to be engaged. The stakeholders need to be engaged. The reason why that's important is because they're the ones that are generally driving the initiatives. They're approving the expenditures, they're approving the policies, the procedures that allow you to comply with whatever governance body that you're regulated to. Okay?
No.
So
we'll
talk about lots and lots of different organizations and different governance bodies, but ITGI is one, for example, the IT Governance Institute. And these are their quote-unquote defined objectives, right? Be informed about information security. Check. That's simple enough. Set direction to drive policy and strategy. By the way, ITGI is not a industry-specific governance body, right? They're not driving specific regulation and policy. These are kind of general directives that they recommend for any IT organization. And by the way, these directives are pretty straightforward. They're pretty obvious, right? Include resources to security objectives. What does that mean? Include resources to security objectives. Make sure that you define what your security objectives are, but make sure you allocate appropriate resources so that you can meet those objectives, right? Assign management responsibilities. Set your priorities. If you're doing a risk assessment, one of the components of a risk assessment or one of the outcomes, I should say, of a risk assessment is to allow you to be able to set your priorities based on the threat vectors and your risk posture, right? Sometimes you might want to dedicate more resources or more personnel or more controls to a specific risk because it's more likely to affect your business than another risk might be, all right? Support required changes, meaning you know that you want to meet these particular objectives. You know that these are the guidelines you have to follow to meet those objectives. Make sure you have things in place to support those required changes, which, by the way, could include technical controls, administrative controls, and physical controls. Could include training. It could include knowledge transfer, etc. Define cultural values related to risk assessment. What does that mean? Define your cultural values related to risk assessment. One of the most challenging aspects to ensuring business continuity and assuring your particular security posture is personnel. Individuals that are responsible for implementing controls, whether they're administrative, like the Human Resources Department, or technical, like the IT department, or physical, like your security guards and your checks and balances that you have for physical security. Security is about culture. It's about identifying a way of thinking, I guess you could say. From an information assurance perspective, you and I think a certain way, right? From the security perspective, not everybody does, right? The janitors and the HR folks and the sales folks, they all might think from a different perspective. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So it is about a culture. Defining a ubiquitous security architecture and security posture is about defining culture. It's a very important aspect. You'll see that a lot on the test. So think from that perspective in the exam. It's not always from the perspective of the IT professional or the security professional. It can be from the perspective of anybody in the organization. And you'll see that a lot on the exam, right? Get assurance from auditors. So don't implement everything and just assume everything is working. Have checks and balances. Have third parties come in. Identify whether or not your controls are meeting your objectives. Oftentimes, being in front of things, we might not have the same perspective as somebody coming in and looking from the side, right? Security investments to promote program effectiveness, right? Typically, that involves training. Of course, you have to. It involves, the implementation of technology, but security investments to promote program effectiveness could also involve training as well. All right. Draft security policies with business input. Define your roles and responsibilities. So now we're kind of moving into this whole, the framework was listed previously. Now we're really getting into how we implement this framework. Identify your threats, your vulnerabilities, implement your security infrastructures and controls, ensure governing bodies approve those policies. That's, of course, to say if you're regulated by those governing bodies, which, by the way, that particular bullet point, this one right here, would probably involve some sort of auditing process or some sort of test and verification process. Establish priorities and implement those security policies. Monitor for breaches. Not only do we implement, but we also have to monitor. Conduct reviews and tests. Remember, security is always a living, breathing thing, so we have to make sure that we're constantly reviewing our posture and testing our controls, reinforce awareness and education, and finally, build security into systems development lifecycle. Meaning, if you're going to implement new technology, or if you're going to implement a new department, or if you're going to implement or hire new people, security should be interwoven into that process, right? Don't put in a new web server, don't hire a new bus driver unless you've actually gone through and done your background check on that bus driver, or done your assessment and interviewed stakeholders, etc., for implementing the new server, right? Make sense? So very, very important concept. I mean, you look at these two slides here, right? They make sense. And really, this whole ITGI governance directive is really what this whole class is all about. That's why we talk about it right in the beginning, okay? So the organization goals, your missions, your objectives, protect your assets, of course. We use physical, administrative, and technical controls, and they have operational and managerial as well. We'll talk about those, but they're kind of related with administrative. But, you know, we have to have those control mechanisms in place. Manage your assets to reduce the risk of or loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That's CIA triad that we talked about. Information security management validates those policies. It validates the procedures, the standards, the guidelines. Really, that's a very important concept to understand. You can implement everything, but unless you're validating your posture and you're validating your procedures and your policies, it's kind of pointless, right? 100%, this is a very, very important bullet point, 100% risk mitigation is not practical, right? So risks are constantly changing, your posture constantly changes. So we always talk about risk mitigation from the concept or perspective of reducing your exposure, period. You can't get rid of your exposure, but you can reduce your exposure. What are some of the options that we have? Some of the options we have are I lost my train of thought there. I had to sneeze. Risk mitigation can happen in a couple of different ways. I guess that's what I was trying to say, right? We can accept the risk. Right. What's the concept of accepting the risk? I know that we're vulnerable here, but it's not really that critical to our business. It's not that important, so we're just accepting it, right? What about risk avoidance? Risk avoidance. Okay, we'll put that one to the side. Risk mitigation. That's the easiest one to understand.
You have employee training.
Right. Controls, right?
Yep.
Implementing controls to mitigate risk. Now, risk avoidance. How is that different?
You've actually taken steps to actually mitigate the risk.
Risk avoidance is not exposing yourself to the risk at all. So you can make a decision, and this is a distinction they'll make on the exam. You can make a decision to not do something because it introduces risk into your organization. Right? For example, I could say, we don't want to take credit cards because that introduces compliance regulations that we have to meet, that introduces risk to my organization. So risk avoidance is saying, this is the risk if we do this, we're not going to do it. That's different than mitigation, right? Right. Mitigation is we're going to do it, but now we're going to implement these controls to reduce our risk exposure.
I was seeing as steps that we were taking to avoid risk.
You can't avoid risk. Risk always exists. You can mitigate risk.
Okay.
Right? So you can reduce the likelihood that a threat vector can be realized but you can't get rid of it completely. From the perspective of CISSP, risk mitigation and risk avoidance are different things. Risk avoidance is the concept of simply not doing something so that you're not exposed to that risk. If Windows XP has a vulnerability, well, don't put any Windows XP machines in the network, right? That's risk avoidance. Risk mitigation is we're going to have to put in Windows XP machines because we have this software that needs to run it, but we can put in these controls to reduce that risk factor. Okay? Make sense? All right. What about risk transfer? Risk transfer would be a concept in which you understand the risk, but you're going to transfer that risk to another entity. Most common example that you see is insurance, right? Getting automobile insurance or medical insurance or health insurance. Now, granted, you're not reducing the likelihood you're going to get in a car accident. You're not reducing the likelihood that you're going to get an arm chopped off in a thresher accident, but you're reducing the impact that that has on you financially and medically and whatnot by buying insurance, right, to pay for those bills or to recover your assets or whatever it might be. Probably from a technical perspective, one of the most common examples that I use for regarding risk transfer would be, I don't want to assume all the risk of running my own Exchange server, so I'm going to use Office 365. Right? I'm transferring the risk of managing those systems and securing those systems to a different entity. Right? I don't have to worry about securing my Exchange server anymore. I don't have to worry. I still have to worry about the security of my email account, but you know, I'm transferring some of that risk. That makes sense? By the way, we're going to get into all this again later on, but risk mitigation is just one aspect of managing risk. So you've got distinctively different silos when it comes to risk. Risk avoidance, risk transfer, risk management, risk acceptance. Make sense? And this is why it's, you know, why we go through this class, obviously, to understand those variances and those differences. All right? Security risk management relationships. Security professionals act as risk advisors. Right? I mean, that's really your goal, is to become, as an IA individual, for all of you guys, is to become an advisor for security, right? Management weighs all the risks of the business, and they choose the controls that they decide to implement based on those variables. All right? As a consultant, as a security professional, that is essentially your job, is to take a look at the big picture from multiple perspectives and then decide what you're going to do from that perspective. Relationships among risk, implementing policies and controls in response to risk. So that would be what? Mitigation, right? Implementing policies and controls means I'm trying to mitigate risk. Awareness of expectations, meaning that there has to be a way for you to identify that once these controls have been implemented, what is the end result, right? You have to be able to go to your management, to the board of directors, to the governance agencies and say, these are the things that we've done, these are the risks, these are the things that we've done, this is what we expect those things to result in, right? We're not getting rid of the risk 100%, but we are ensuring that if this occurs, then this can happen. Or if somebody tries to implement this threat vector, we're protected because of this, this control, right? Monitoring effectiveness, auditing, of course, is a very important aspect of that, especially if you fall under a governance regulation, right, or any type of IT governance. You're going to have some sort of auditing process or effectiveness process, and then using knowledge as input to go through the next assessment. That is a really, really important concept. And by the way, this is highlighted because this is the basic life cycle of risk, right? Implement policies and controls to respond to risk. Now, the one thing that's missing from this, of course, would be to identify those risks initially, right? That's one of the things that's missing from this. But it is very important. Everything beyond this is very important, right? So we have a little picture here. This guy here is pointing at it, but this is assess risk and determine the needs. So that's the bullet point that's missing from, or the one component that's missing from that previous bullet point, right? Implement your policies and controls, right? Promote awareness, monitor, and evaluate. I think the arrows are in the wrong direction there, but you get the idea, right? I define what my risk is, determine what my needs are to mitigate that risk, or transfer the risk, or accept the risk, whatever it is. I implement my controls and policies. I promote awareness, very important aspect, because one of the biggest things in the security space that we talk about is things like social engineering, being able to identify how people respond and participate in a secure environment, whether it's them. A perfect example, and I probably shouldn't put this on video, but I'm going to. One of my employees gets an email with a Word attachment that says, I need you to do a money transfer of $23,000 to my bank account. And not only did that employee open the email, they opened the attachment, and then they forwarded the attachment to me because they thought it was for me, right? You can't prevent that. Technically, yeah, you can have controls in place that can filter out emails like that, but eventually some of those things are going to get through. Whether it's an email with an attachment, whether it's an email with a link or whatever. So the social aspect of security is extremely important. Really important, right? There's only so many things you can do technically and physically to control security. There's always that social aspect. So promoting awareness is a big, big component to that, right? And then, of course, monitor and evaluate. Monitor and evaluate. All right? So organizational processes and changes, you have to understand business transformational events and business entities. If you're hired as a consultant, and our organization is hired quite often to do this kind of thing, to do maybe a security assessment, security posture assessment. You can't go into a business and simply look at the business from a technical perspective. That is the biggest thing about this CISSP. We are so used to, like I said, as engineers, looking at things from a technical perspective. But you have to look at things from the business perspective. You have to look at it from the overall big picture, right? So if somebody comes to us and says, we want you to come into our organization and audit our network and audit our processes and procedures, the first thing you have to understand is, what line of business are you in? What kinds of organizations do you interact with? What kind of daily transactions do you perform? What kind of information do you collect from your customers? All of these things are very important when it comes to understanding security, right? What do they mean by understand business transformational events? What would be an example? Well, business entities is what I was just describing. But what would be an example of a business transformational event? Acquisitions, mergers, layoffs. Businesses go through massive layoffs because of the economy. Well, guess what? If you're firing 3,000 people, what's the likelihood that some of those people are probably going to be disgruntled, right? What's the offboarding procedure that you have for those individuals? How do you ensure that they're not taking intellectual property with them, that they're not going to go to a competitor and give them information? That's a transformational event, right? And a lot of times security is driven by those events. Ensure situational awareness and management decisions that are being made. All right? Yeah, it makes sense. Situational awareness is everything that I just described. If I'm going to go to a business and identify what their security posture is, I need to understand that business, right? I'm not just looking at a firewall and saying, do you have open ports, right? I'm looking at the business as a whole. And then the management decisions being made. Oftentimes, businesses are not always led by the strongest chiefs, right? So they're making decisions that affect their security posture. And as an information assurance individual, you need to change that thinking, that culture. But you have to do it in a way that they have to feel like it's their own decision, and they're the ones actually coming up with the idea. It's interesting, that we talk about that. Common activities that impact security professionals include acquisitions and mergers, divestitures and spin-offs, meaning we're selling off a portion of the business or breaking off a portion of the business, governance committees and so on. Governance is a big one, right? Governance drives a lot of businesses today, especially in specific sectors. So what is an acquisition and merger? Different data types may need protection. Obviously, if I'm buying an organization or merging with another organization, I'm bringing in new personnel. I don't know what the security culture of that previous organization was. I don't know what policies or procedures they had in place, right? Different technology types. Maybe they're running EIGRP and I'm running OSPF, and we have a secure OSPF architecture. They have an open EIGRP architecture. So I have to find a way of ensuring that technology gets integrated into my security posture. New staff and roles with needs for security awareness and training. Makes sense. I don't really have to explain that. Basically, these folks weren't exposed to the same culture that my folks were exposed to. Because I've got a CISSP on my staff, and he's driving this culture, or she's driving this culture, and these guys that came on board, worked at a surf shop, so they didn't have any security culture, right? Threats to former or new employees, obvious, right? Whether it's data loss, intellectual property right loss, even if it's not malicious, right? Employees leave, they have knowledge about your organization. They have knowledge about your business. Or if they come in, they don't have knowledge. Vulnerabilities with merged systems, new policies, standards, procedures for compliance. That's an interesting one, right? Maybe I'm a training company that doesn't accept credit cards, but then I acquire another training company, and that's always been their process, is to accept credit cards. Well, now I've accepted now, as part of that business acquisition, that risk. So I have to make sure that my procedures for compliance are adequate to support that risk or mitigate it. External business partners and needs of assessment. Why is this particularly important today? You see this a lot, by the way, on some of the other, we don't talk about it so much in this class, but some of the other information assurance certifications. This is really, really big today. Why is this such an important factor today?
When you overlap, you accept their risk?
Well, absolutely. When you're performing information exchange with an external partner, you don't have control over that environment. You're not merging companies. You're utilizing an external party. The Target breach, right, happened a couple of years ago, where all the credit cards were released. Well, it wasn't actually Target's fault. It was the processing company's fault. They're the ones that got compromised. Target was the front person, right, because they're the ones that hired the security company, and they're the ones that get all the bad press, but it was actually the credit card processing company that got breached, right? But there's another aspect to this that I'm talking about. External, think about this from a technical perspective. It's kind of a stretch, so I don't expect you guys to get it. But when I say it, you'll know exactly what I mean. External business partners. How about if I write this? What is all this stuff?
As a service concepts?
Cloud. Right? Cloud technology, right? Unless you're running a private cloud where you can control everything, isn't a cloud essentially an external business partner? Absolutely, right? And you'll see this a lot on CISSP and some of the other certifications, but they talk a lot about cloud security. And this bullet point really relates to that quite a bit. External business partners would be those cloud partners. The ones that are providing infrastructure as a service, or platform as a service, or software as a service, or anything as a service. IaaS is infrastructure as a service, and SaaS is software as a service, and PaaS is platform as a service, and XaaS is anything as a service. But isn't that, I mean, that's how many people are using these cloud services today? And that's a big, big deal, right? So if you're, especially if you're doing multi-tenancy, where you're not using a public/private cloud, but you're using most public clouds are multi-tenancy. So you have additional security concerns that you have to worry about, right? But that you know, in the past, external business partners was pretty limited, right? Yeah, you may have a financial group that's processing your credit cards, or you might have you know, another company that maybe is building widgets for you for your production line or whatever. But now a lot of businesses are involved with these external entities in the form of these cloud-based providers. So if they're not secure, how could you be secure? Divestitures and spin-offs. Security professionals should be aware of data loss and data leakage due to leaving employees. I don't really need to explain much about that, right? Just like you have a process for bringing individuals into your organization, that's called onboarding, you need to have a process for individuals leaving the organization, offboarding, right? And by the way, the severity of that will change depending on how the employee leaves, right? Ideally, you'd like them to, hey, well, I got a new job, I'm going to go do this, great, we're very happy for you, versus you're fired, right? Because typically the employee that gets fired, gets laid off unexpectedly, they might have different feelings about protecting your intellectual property, right? Systems, interconnections, protocols, and ports left open when no longer needed. I see this all the time. In fact, we just did an assessment for one of our clients, and they had 20 or 30 open ports on the firewall. We identified that those ports were there for relationships that they had with organizations 10 years ago. And the relationships go away, but nobody has a procedure for offboarding those relationships to go through. And so this is something that you see quite a bit, right? Loss of logging and visibility of monitoring systems not kept in-house. Not sure why this one is listed as, I suppose that would fall under the spin-off category, but threats from employees laid off or forced out. Different than data loss and data leakage due to leaving employees, because the threats from employees being laid off, well, that's probably typically, could be more impactful to your business. The need for revised policies and procedures for new entities. That really should fall under the previous category, right? New entities would be acquisitions and mergers. Deadlines for data segregation, okay? This is important because if you're spinning off a part of your business, or you're divesting a part of your business, maybe you're selling a part of your business to another entity, obviously that data needs to go with that business, right? And you might have these commingled systems that allow data to be processed. So obviously you want to be able to segregate that information and separate that information. Makes sense, all right? Governance committees. Yeah, well, we know what those are. They're responsible for developing policies, right? Now, a governance committee could be a third party driving security policies and procedures. in your organization based on industry regulations, or it could be an internal review board, right? One of the most common types of governance committees that we see today, CCB. Has heard of that term, CCB? Change Control Board. Right? What is the responsibility of a change control board in an organization? Any ideas? Oftentimes, governance falls under this category, by the way. When I worked at NASA, that we had, everything was done through CCB.
Is it where like a group ensures that change isn't happening so quickly that we can't keep up?
That's part of it. Absolutely, that's part of it. So here, quite simply, and that's definitely part of it, stakeholders get together and decide what the impact of change is on their organization, whether it's personnel change, technical changes, policy changes, whatever. And
I've also found that one of the great sides of CCB also is making sure that you update relevant areas that may be impacted, not even so much in what needs to be decided on, but also updating like processes and procedures in other areas. Absolutely,
right. You're implementing new technology, well, guess what? There's a domino effect. That new technology affects other technology, right? Oftentimes in organizations, if we talk just from a technical perspective, personnel aside and policy aside, from a technical perspective, oftentimes organizations operate in silos. You have your server team, you have your infrastructure team, you have your security team, you have your voice team, and the voice team is making changes to the network and infrastructure that the security team's not aware of, or the server team's not aware of, right? I mean, we see organizations operate like that all the time, right? So the purpose of a CCB, which is essentially a governance committee, is to say everybody from those, all the key stakeholders from those different silos get together and say, you're going to make this change. Okay, this is what we have to do. This is what we have to do. No, you can't do that because it'll affect this, and so on, right? That's a change control board. And Bob was right. It's also about identifying new policies, procedures, guidelines, etc. That's what a governance committee is, right? Determines missing qualifications, characteristics needed for effectiveness. Oh, you're going to implement a new CRM, or you're going to implement a new database? Well, you can't do that unless we open up these ports on the firewall, or unless we implement this new VLAN. Make sense? So as a security professional, you should know how board functions, how any board functions, ensure a high level of understanding and importance of security risk management. In other words, your input into this board is the security aspect of it, right? As an information assurance individual, you're hopefully going to be involved in these governance bodies so that you can offer your input on the impact of security from the perspective of change, okay? Ensure board members' aptitude for security risk management. That's usually kind of secondary in a lot of people's opinions, or a lot of people's day-to-day operations. They want to get something done because they need it for business operations. We have to make X number of sales a month, so we need to implement this technology, or we need to implement this policy without any visibility of risk, right? So as an information assurance individual or security professional, your job is to make sure that those board members are looking at this from the perspective of security as well. Make sense? It's pretty logical, right? Maintain a working relationship with the members and respond to risk, privacy, and information security questions. Yeah, well, yeah, you're the SME. You're the individual that wears that security shield, and you're supposed to be the subject matter expert. You look like you have something to say.
Yeah, just a ton of questions are going through my head right now.
Well, ask them.
So, in a real world setting, because I can't really, I mean, I can shoot from my own personal experiences, but I know that
Right.
So with that being the case, how many IT teams, like how many IT organizations positioned in a corporation are actually abiding by this type structure and this type of logic? Because in my personal opinion, the DoD is suffering in an incredible way from not having this type of structure. Like they're implementing a ton of different concepts, a ton of different programs and all that type of stuff, but nobody's really shooting from a true technical background.
Right.
So you end up with these crazy issues with latency and just all this stuff. So my ultimate question is realistically, how many corporations actually function this way?
From our experience, not many. Not many. You know, it depends on the organization, right? And everybody's perspective is always different too, right? The CEO's perspective of security is completely different than the system administrator's perspective of security, right? And because the CEO is concerned about the bottom line. Is this going to affect the revenue of the business, right? Because you're talking about private versus public sector. So speaking from the private sector perspective, because that's what we do a lot of business in, that is what the CEO is responsible for. Is this going to affect our bottom line? Right? Is it a public? If it's a public company, is this going to affect our shareholders? Is this going to, make us profitable or not profitable? Right? So a lot of the decisions that are driven are based from that perspective, which doesn't really involve security at all. And then you got your system administrator, which is being tasked with performing responsibilities to make sure that the CEO's objectives are met, which also probably isn't driven from a security perspective as well. So to answer the first part of your question, the answer is no. There aren't a lot of businesses that we've seen, unless there's only one exception to that, but there aren't a lot of businesses that we've seen that put this focus into the organization from a security perspective. The exception to that is businesses that are regulated by their industry, right? Because if you're in healthcare, you have to be HIPAA compliant. If you're in the financial sector, you have to follow specific financial governance regulations, and you have to be audited to make sure you're meeting those responsibilities. Now, ultimately, what happens is, and when we get hired, is that audit happens and they fail. Because the third party says, oh, you didn't do this, you didn't do this, you didn't do this. I just installed some new controls for our organization specifically based on that result. All right? So that's where the culture comes in. Now, people are becoming a lot more aware as more and more businesses get integrated to the global e-commerce world, right? More and more businesses are aware of the impact and the need for security because everything is published now, right? Breaches occur, it's published. Information gets lost, there's immediate impact to the business. So it is much more prevalent today. At least the idea of security is much more prevalent today than it was 10 years ago, right? Or 15 years ago. Now, all that being said, and this is the challenge, because as an information assurance professional, your job is not to be an expert in all of these areas, right? There's no way that as an individual you can be an expert in personnel management, an expert in server deployment, an expert in infrastructure. That's not the goal of a CISSP. The goal of a CISSP is to direct those individuals, to give them guidelines, to identify weaknesses and vulnerabilities, not from a technical perspective, but from a general perspective. Does that make sense? So as a information assurance individual, you're not expected to be able to know how to patch a server. or to configure a firewall, or to configure access lists on a router, or to ensure that you're going to pass an audit from some sort of governance body. Your goal is to bring everybody together that has those skills and capabilities. Does that make sense? So you have to think of this from a broad perspective, right? You're the individual that goes to the organization and makes the people that are the experts in those respective fields aware that this needs to be done.
I guess my question is, the experts that you're enforcing the rules about, like, how do they not already know and comprehend that as
They may be aware, but they're only looking at it from a microscopic perspective. You're looking at it from a macroscopic perspective.
Yeah, exactly what you're getting at.
Right? You're trying to bring attention to the big picture. They're saying, well, yeah, I've got to patch my servers. Okay, but you got to patch your servers, but that impacts everything, right? You can't just say, well, that's your only responsibility. You have to think about it from the perspective of the organization. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's not that you need to have those technical skills. It's that you need to understand the impact of the different, and that's what the 8 domains are for, right? Physical security, you're not going to be an expert in putting in CCTV cameras or electrified fences or whatever, but you know you need defense in depth. You know you need that to have, so your goal is, oh, I identified this weakness. Now I'm going to go engage this stakeholder or this SME to mitigate that risk, right? Does that make sense? All right. So, and then, by the way, that's how you think of this from the perspective of the exam too. That's really how the exam is structured. It's a macroscopic view of security as opposed to that microscopic view that you would see from an individual. Okay? So for your security organization structure, information, well, these are some of the kind of the titles of individuals that would be in the organization, right? ISSO, Information System Security Officer, CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, and CIO, Chief Information Officer. These individuals within the organization generally are more technical, right? They're going to have more of an understanding of the technical controls in the organization, but that now often includes informational and physical security, right? Particularly physical security, because physical security often involves technology today, doesn't it? Right? I mean, we have a company that we work with that their entire CCTV camera system is Cisco, IP-based, right? Time clocks are biometric. The access to facilities are proximity readers and vein scanners and fingerprint scanners and so on. So we're now starting to see a lot of integration of technical aspects into physical control. Security functions may be risk management functions with focus that falls outside of IT, being that you're kind of the chief information security person. So oftentimes a lot of your focus is on that on those technical controls, but it's going to involve the use of administrative or physical controls as well. And reporting should be to your C-level executives, right? The CISO or the ISSO is going to report to the CIO or even the CEO of the organization, all right? Or the board of directors, by the way, which is, pretty much like a CEO of a company, right? An information security officer, in general, which is what you're hopefully going to become, ensures protection of business information assets from loss, disclosure, alteration, destruction, and unavailability, right? Loss, confidentiality. Disclosure, confidentiality. Alteration, integrity. Destruction, unavailability, availability. Every one of those things that we mentioned in that bullet point is the CIA triad, isn't it? Right? Data loss and data disclosure is confidentiality. All right? You have to define policies, and you direct others in the organization to implement and execute those policies. That's exactly what I was describing before the break. As an information assurance individual, you're not necessarily executing the policies, you're driving the policy. You're driving directives, you're driving other individuals in the organization to meet an overall security goal. Obviously, ever-evolving risk means you have to be very dynamic in nature. Your job is constantly changing, and you have to constantly assess and reassess the situation. All right? Most policies are drafted to last 2 to 3 years. Yeah, maybe. I mean, for the most part, right? You're certainly not going to try and, it's not practical to say that you're going to assess and reassess and change your posture every few months, right? It just wouldn't be very practical. You'd always be focusing on those changes instead of actually focusing on business operations. And that's a big aspect to understand too, right? And this goes to what you were saying before. It's not always business operations, and the objective of the business as an entity is not always congruent with implementing security. In fact, security often hinders business objectives and business productivity, right? It's kind of like a very simple concept would be to say you have a secure password policy in your organization. 16 characters, complex passwords, etc. That frustrates users and individuals, right? And oftentimes they'll try to find ways to circumvent that, whether it's writing down a password on a sticky note or whatever, or putting it in a text document so they can cut and paste it, whatever, right? So oftentimes those two objectives, security objectives and just day-to-day operations, don't really gel together. So you try to draft a policy, you try to draft a security solution that allows the business to continue to function, but still provides that level of security. That's a very difficult thing to balance out. Officers ensure security policies, procedures, baseline standards, and guidelines to address information security needs. Pretty straightforward. Policies may differ if your organization is a technology follower or an early adopter. That's absolutely true as well. All right, imagine the difference in your security posture if you're SpaceX versus Kia, right? Kia is not really bleeding edge or introducing these brand new technologies into their business, right? They're basically in the business of making the same thing over and over again. So not a lot of dynamics, not a lot of things change. But if you're a company like SpaceX, where you have, you're constantly adapting new technology, you're engineering new solutions and implementing new solutions that nobody else has done before, that's a little bit more challenging, right? So that will drive your posture as well, whether or not you're kind of a technology follower or a bleeding edge leader, right? Let's see, compliance is ensuring adherence to policies. And that's really, unfortunately, that's the downside of being an information assurance person, is you have to make sure that people are adhering to whatever directives you're developing for that organization. So you have to be aware of changing regulatory developments. If, for example, if you're in the healthcare industry, well, the government comes out with new HIPAA restrictions, well, you have to be aware of that. You have to be monitoring that. You have to be able to identify those deltas and then be able to identify what has to change in your business to be able to make sure that you're meeting those objectives. Officers implement and operate computer incident response teams, okay? CERTs, you'll see that term referenced on the exam. A computer incident response team doesn't really have to be computer related. Any kind of incident response team kind of follows the same model. You have to take a look at an incident, look at the damage it caused, respond to the incident, repair the systems, and then hopefully do a lessons learned afterwards to identify whether or not you can mitigate that risk in the future, right? For example, natural disasters, earthquake, fire, flood, you might be able to either reinforce the structure of your building or implement some bollards if somebody drove a car through your building, whatever, to kind of mitigate that risk in the future, right? There was something else I was going to say about this. There is a concept that you may see on the test. I don't even think it's mentioned in this courseware at all. It's called a tabletop exercise. Have you guys ever heard of that? You guys online, or you as well? No? Okay. A tabletop exercise is essentially where stakeholders get around a table. That's why it's called a tabletop exercise. And they walk through scenarios. And they identify incidents. So an HR person might be involved in this exercise. Security guard might be involved in this exercise. The server administrator, the network administrator might be involved, because they all offer different perspectives on incidents, right? Even a CIO or a CISSO or whatever might be involved as well. And the goal of a tabletop exercise is to simulate different scenarios, right? And say, okay, if this happens, what do we do? Because the human resources individual's perspective of that is completely different than the server administrator's perspective of that, right? If an exchange server gets compromised, the IT professional is worried about the physical resources, right? Whereas the HR person is worried about PII, personally identifiable information. And they each have a different perspective on what that vulnerability is. So if you get these groups together and you walk through the scenarios, you can identify those different things. As an information assurance individual, your goal is to drive those types of things to happen. Because you don't have to necessarily have the same perspective that everybody else has. You need to bring people together that have different perspectives. So you might see that term on the test. Now, the reason I mentioned tabletop exercise is because a computer incident response team, the name itself kind of suggests that it's a response team to an event, right? But these groups can also perform proactive exercises to prevent risk or to mitigate risk, okay? Officers are leaders in awareness and education on security issues and reporting actions. Same thing I've been saying over and over again. Your goal as a security officer is to make people aware of your perspective as a whole, macro perspective, not micro perspective. Officers involved in management teams and planning meetings for project directions and decisions. Again, from the security perspective, not from a business objective perspective. And then you have to know organization's mission, you have to know the organization's objectives, goals, and plans to implement appropriate security controls. These are not always married together. Plans to implement appropriate security controls don't always directly correlate to a business mission or a business objective or a business goal. You have to integrate those. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So a security officer has to understand business threats and vulnerabilities and communicate those risks to management, usually in a non-technical sense, usually from a C-level perspective. What's the biggest thing that they're concerned about? Well, it depends, right? Let's add a little bit to that question. So if it's in the private sector, what's the biggest thing that a C-level executive is going to be concerned about?
Profitability?
Profitability, right. I mean, most businesses are in business to make money, right, ultimately. The reason why I mentioned private sectors, because public sector is obviously a little bit different. The Department of the Army or the Air Force is not in business to make money, right? They have a different objective. But in the private sector, from a C-level perspective, C-level meaning CEO, CIO, CFO, those guys, their goal is to make sure that the business is making money, the business is profitable, right? They don't care about business threats and vulnerabilities necessarily. In fact, that becomes kind of a liability to the business in a sense that you have to have capital expenditures to mitigate that stuff. But you have to, as an information security individual, convince those C-level executives that these threats are real, and you need to do this in order to mitigate that risk. I see it all the time. I watch, there's a show on CNBC that I watch all the time called American Greed. And if you haven't seen it, I highly suggest you check it out. It's basically all about scams and financial scams and business scams and whatnot. And ultimately, a lot of them are directly related to businesses. Just all they care about is their bottom line. They don't care about the privacy of individuals affected by breaches or whatever. They just care about the bottom line. So they're going to cut corners or whatever they can do to increase that profitability, right? Executive management team goal is to balance between acceptable risk and business operations. That is a really important bullet point. It's always a balance. You can implement so many controls in your organization that operations are ineffective, right? Basically, you're locking down your business to a point where it just simply can't be productive. Or you can go completely the opposite direction. Everything is productive, but there's no security. So it is completely a balance between those operations. You have to balance risk with process, right? And what we mean by balance between acceptable risk is to say, it's not practical to have all of my individuals in the organization have a 30-character password. Yes, that's going to mitigate risk against brute force attacks, but, what would be more acceptable? Well, maybe 10 characters, or maybe 12 characters, or maybe some sort of multi-factor authentication. So it makes it easier for business operations, but it also mitigates risk, all right? As an information security professional, you're not concerned with technical details, but the cost benefit of the solution and the residual risk in the end, right? What is residual risk? By definition, what is residual risk?
Risk that continues after a given point.
Right. It's the remaining risk footprint after you've implemented controls. You've got your initial risk, you've got your controls, you've got your residual risk, right? Obviously, the residual risk should always be less than the initial risk. All right? This is a really important bullet point, too, because this is kind of what I've been saying the whole time. You're not responsible for the minutia of the implementation. You're responsible for the big picture. I keep saying that over and over again, right? What typical questions regarding security risk would you ask? What is the real perceived threat? Okay? It's interesting that we say that because as an information security professional, you're pretty much, it's pretty much assumed that you have the knowledge to be able to differentiate between fake and real, right? It's like today, in today's world, we have to filter out the news because you have to figure out what's real news and what's fake news, right? it's all sensationalistic. Whether it's Fox or CNN or whoever it might be, you have to interpret that information, and you don't shoot from the hip. You have to make decisions based on reality, not based on perspective. So a perceived threat might not be a real perceived threat. You have to identify that. All right, what is the risk to operations? What is the cost or the safeguard that we're going to implement? What will be the residual risk after the safeguard has been implemented, and how long will the project take? All right. By the way, these 5 bullet points you see here, that is really what the test is all about. All right. Now, we incorporate things like technical controls, administrative controls, and physical controls in this process, but this is really what the whole CISSP is about. Threat, risk to operations, cost to do the safeguards, residual risk, and we'll talk about this after the break when we get into doing actual risk assessment. Okay? From a reporting model perspective, the primary goal is to maintain the importance of information security. You need to convince the people that are involved in implementing these systems that security should be a concern. Limit inaccurate information due to a number of parties involved and company hierarchy. You're the go-between. You're like I said, a lot of organizations, they're going to operate in silos, right? Server team, network team, voice team, security team. Everybody's operating in these silos. Well, you're supposed to make sure that the information is flowing between those different silos. All right? You want senior management's attention focused on security concerns. And by the way, oftentimes that means that you're trying to get buy-in, right? You have to convince senior management that this is important. Why? Because they're going to have to invest capital. They're going to have to invest time. They're going to have to invest personnel into facilitating those resources, right? So you need to have a budget for those resources and so on. There needs to be an individual responsible for ensuring information security throughout the enterprise and assuring accountability. Isn't that the whole job of a IA person, right? You're the person that's supposed to be driving everything. You're not implementing everything, you're driving everything, the directives and the procedures. Reporting to the CEO ensures that the messages are correctly and directly conveyed. You're not reporting to somebody else who's reporting to somebody else who's reporting to somebody else. Credit card companies, technology companies, companies with revenues dependent on internet commerce would probably use this method. By the way, we're talking about still high-level individuals. We're not talking about a system administrator or a network administrator. We're talking about the information security person, right? Reporting to the CEO may be required to meet compliance. Actually, that's very true. Some compliance organizations require that direct interaction between the information security professional and the CEO. So there's direct accountability, right? And that, by the way, that CEO component could be the CEO, it could be a board of directors, it could be shareholders, it could be, the 4-star general, right? It just depends on who the chief is. All right? U.S. civilian government agencies required to report breach of personal information to the U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness Team, CERT, within an hour of discovery. This is just an example, like what I was just saying. When we say reporting to the CEO, we're not really speaking of the CEO as an individual. We're thinking of the CEO as the head of the snake, right? So CERT, in the case of a U.S. civilian government agency, would be the head of the snake. All right? You could report to the IT department. This is generally, for operational standpoint and implementation standpoint, as opposed to, a breach or whatever it might be. Security officers report directly to the CIO or director of IT or head of IT. This would be generally maybe a smaller organization that A company that has 10,000 employees, it's going to be really difficult for the security personnel to report directly to the CEO. So there might be a second tier of reporting structure in this particular case. In this method, security is often viewed only as a technical problem. Makes sense, right? The CEO is a non-technical person. The CIO typically is a more technical individual. Chief Information Officer or Chief Technology Officer, depending on how you look at it, generally comes from a background of technology. Now, they've moved into a project management / senior management type role, but they do have that background knowledge for technology. So they may not be responsible, the CIO or CTO may not be responsible for implementing the components, but they understand those implementations. All right? The advantage is an understanding of technical risk. You go to a CEO and say, well, this server needs to be patched. The CEO is going to go, I don't even know what that means, right? But a CIO would. All right? The downside is a conflict of interest with the CIO's goals oriented to delivery of the application and products to support the business. Generally speaking, a CIO's goals don't necessarily correspond to a CEO's goals. CIOs and CTOs tend to be more technical, so they have objectives and goals that are related to technology, whereas a CEO is more business driven. All right? Generally, a model that's avoided because of the individuals that are between the CEO and the CIO and the information security officer. I don't know. I mean, whether you're reporting to the CEO or whether you're reporting to an IT department or an IT structure, as an information assurance individual, your goals should pretty much be the same because you're not talking in technical terms. You're talking in business terms. Budget consideration, the information security officer provides budget for information security. Make sure that budgets are included in each department. Again, this is a very important concept because not only are you driving the objectives across the board, administrative, physical, technical, you're driving those objectives, which involve lots and lots of different departments. You should be able to, and by the way, you might not be establishing these budgets yourself, but you should be able to collect this information. So you might go to the HR department and say, okay, we need to implement social engineering training. All right? Now the HR department's not going to necessarily know what social engineering is. As a security professional, you know what social engineering is. And so you know that, okay, we need to do a class on using email securely. We need to do a class on physical security related to social engineering. So no tailgating, no over-the-shoulder surfing, those kinds of things. So you define those objectives, right? But then that typically will come out of a different budget. It's not going to come out of the server team's budget. It's not going to come out of the network team's budget. It's going to come out of the HR budget because those are people-related functions, right? We're training individuals. So anyway, that's something to think about. Also consider the cost over the life cycle, not just because security is a living, breathing thing. It's not just a one-time thing. Security officers must work with managers so security is included in the project cost. Access administration, intrusion detection, emerging technologies get funded. Again, that's all related. Those are all technical controls. Well, access administration could be physical, but same thing as the HR analogy that I provided. Examine the current risks to identify the tasks with the largest cost benefit. It's important. We go into our risk assessment section after lunch. We're going to talk all about that. Examine the current risks to identify tasks with the largest cost benefit. What does that mean? Examine the current risks to identify, so I want to spend $50,000 to do this. Okay, well, what's the benefit? The benefit is that this risk, which is highly, could affect us a great deal, if it was realized, would cost us $200,000, right? That's the challenge that you have with security. It's not always, I'm going to buy this and I'm going to net this, right? It may be, I'm going to buy this so I don't lose this. See what I'm saying? So we say cost-benefit analysis. It's directly related to maybe identifying cost of something so that we don't lose something down the line. Long-term projects, 12 to 18 months, are less preferred than pilot projects or short-term projects. The longer the payback period, the higher rate of return is expected. Okay? Meaning that if I invest $100,000 into some sort of security architecture, if I'm not realizing the benefit of that $100,000 expenditure over a short period of time, I would expect that the rate of return over a longer period of time would be much higher, right? The number of staff and qualifications, the required protection, the tasks, the training, the regulations, the metric tracking, all of these things drive budgets. And as a security individual, it is your job to ensure that the individuals that are approving those budgets understand the necessity. That's really the key. All right, metrics, measurements, pretty straightforward. They're used to provide information on long-term trends, illustrate day-to-day workload. The goal is to process improvement by monitoring the frequency of events and impact. If you invested a whole bunch of money to mitigate something and you've identified that that risk or that attack keeps happening and you're mitigating that risk, that's a good return on your investment, right? So metrics are a way of essentially measuring the effectiveness of policy, right? Who's going to collect those metrics? What statistics will be collected? You don't want to do paralysis by analysis. You want to make sure that you're collecting only the important information. Where will those statistics be collected? What are the baselines and the thresholds for defining anomalies? And what are the action plans based on the results? Okay? Metrics are not just used for security. They're used for measuring any kind of a performance-based solution, right? Whether it's you're going through the process of upgrading software, firewalls, hardware, whatever, whether you're providing a service to an organization, whatever it might be. Resources that play a role in information security are the following. I'm just going to go through these bullet points quickly because they make perfect sense. Databases, systems, network administrators, policy and compliance officers, and legal counsel, right? By the way, any of these entities can be in-house or they could be external. They don't necessarily have to be in-house. Typically, policy and compliance officers are external, a third party doing auditing or whatever. Law enforcement, certainly external. Quality assurance testers, help desk, service desk technicians. Security programs also supported indirectly by budget officers, procurement officers, business analysts, administrative professionals, architects, and developers, and so on. So these are the kind of the individuals that are wrapped around this whole security architecture. Three major components to strategic planning are integrated. Strategic planning, tactical planning, operations, and project planning. Okay, read the bullet points, now what do they mean? What is the difference, well, we're going to see this over the next few slides, but in general, what is the difference between strategic planning and tactical planning? What is strategy versus tactics? Let's break it down that way. Strategy is what your objective is. Isn't tactics the way you achieve those objectives? The method that you use to achieve an objective, right? Strategy is, hey, I want to accomplish this. It's like a football coach or a basketball coach. Every week they play a different team. Now, the strategy is essentially the method that you're going to use to maybe win the game. The tactics are the techniques that you use to implement the strategy, right? And then operational and project planning is, of course, the planning process to make sure that you meet the goal of whatever strategy you've implemented. We're going to break it down into detail here over the next couple of slides. All right, so strategic planning. Plan should have a long-term horizon, maybe 3 to 5 years. So this is, again, umbrella thinking, right? High-level thinking. What is the overall goal, etc. And so that's more long-term. It should be reviewed minimally on an annual basis or when major changes in the business occur. Technological changes occur often, and plans should be adjusted accordingly. That is very, very true. Business objectives and business procedures typically change over a longer period of time than technology does. Technology is changing constantly. So you definitely need to update your strategy. You don't want to be, still using cassette tapes when everybody else is using DVDs, right? The technology changes that strategy, right? So strategic goals should incorporate security policies and procedures, deploying servers, desktops, network devices, reducing downtime, high availability, etc. Ensuring users understand their security responsibilities and establishing a security organization to manage your enterprise security architecture. Okay, pretty straightforward. So how is that different than tactical planning? Tactical planning is a definition of broad initiatives to achieve the goals in the plan. Plans are more specific. They can incorporate multiple projects. Okay? So again, strategy is long-term, big picture thinking. Right? Yes, you have to incorporate all of these aspects, right? The people that are going to implement your strategy. But tactical is basically the specifics on how you're going to implement that strategy. All right? Typically a much shorter, 6 to 18 months to complete the security goal of the organization. Trying to think of another analogy here. So strategy might be like a go-to-market campaign for a business, to sell something or to manufacture something or to engage in customers. But the tactics change, right? Cold calling was a great way to engage customers 10 years ago or 15 years ago, right? And if you're a business today and that's the only method that you're using to engage with customers, it's old school, right? What's the latest way to engage with customers today? Social media. The strategy didn't change. The goal of the strategy is still to get customers and to gain customers, but the tactics changed. Does that make sense? The methodology changed. All right. Operational and project planning. Plans with milestones, dates, accountabilities, blah, blah, it's project planning. Includes multiple tasks. One of the big tasks, of course, the risk assessment. Again, we're in the past 2 sections, we've been talking about this from the perspective of business operations, but this is a security class, so we need to incorporate these security concepts. Conduct your security risk assessment, develop security policies and approval process, develop technical infrastructure to deploy those policies, train your users, and monitor compliance. I don't know how many times we get to see this, but this is that circle that we saw before. And quite frankly, just about every single governance structure follows this, right? What's the risk? What are the policies? What are the controls we're going to implement to mitigate risk? How are we going to train our users? How do we monitor compliance? It's the same thing over and over again, right? That circle that and we're going to look at COBIT and COBOL and all these other different kind of structures that these organizations provide, and they all say the same thing. Very, very common thread. all right? All righty, that is the end of that lesson.